today's mindful moment. Today we're going deep on Socrates, using Socrates, A Man for Our Times, by Paul Johnson. We're going to try to figure out what he thought was the key to a good life.
Love it.
And what makes this deep dive even more interesting is that we don't just have like one perspective on Socrates. We've got a bunch of different sources we can pull from.
That's right. Socrates, he was the ultimate philosopher, right? Always asking those big questions, sharing his wisdom.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. He never actually wrote anything down himself. So we're left to piece together his philosophy from the memories and interpretations of his students and those around him. It's like solving a puzzle. Each source offers a different piece.
It's like having a 3D view of a really complex person, right?
Exactly.
So the main sources we have are from his students, Plato and Xenophon.
Right.
They both admired Socrates a ton, but they definitely have their own takes on his ideas.
Yeah.
Our source points out that Xenophon, he was a military man, very practical, straightforward. He gave us a kind of like clear-cut, almost textbook version of Socrates, especially in his memoirs.
Right, a soldier's perspective. Practical, to the point.
But the thing is, he might have missed some of the deeper, more nuanced stuff in Socrates' thinking, you know?
Oh, yeah. If Xenophon was all we had, our understanding of Socrates would be, I think, much less rich. We'd miss out on the depth of his impact on philosophy as like a real rigorous field of study.
Exactly. Now, Plato, on the other hand, he was a philosophical giant, like the real deal. His writings are super valuable, but there's a potential complication. So Socrates was like the most important figure in Plato's life, right? He totally shaped his thinking. And Plato wrote all these dialogues, like over 20 of them, featuring Socrates. Plus, we have Socrates' defense speech from his trial and an account of his final days. Now, the early dialogues, those are generally considered the most accurate to the historical Socrates.
But as Plato's own philosophical system developed, he kind of started using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own evolving ideas.
Right. It's like over time, Plato might have started blending his own thoughts with Socrates, kind of like mixing their philosophical DNA. You know,
Right.
Our source calls this Platzock, which I think is pretty clever.
I like that.
And this has made it tricky for scholars to separate the real Socrates from Plato's version of him.
It's debate that's been going on for centuries.
Exactly. But the good news is we've got more than just Plato and Xenophon. We have other sources we can look at.
Right. We've got fragments from Aristophanes, a playwright who was around at the same time as Socrates. Might have even been a friend, but he wrote the satirical play called Clouds, where he kind of pokes fun at Socrates. We also have later writers like Diogenes Laertius, who, writing much later, drew on sources that unfortunately we don't have anymore, and then sprinkle throughout the works of classical and early medieval thinkers, Cicero, Seneca, even St. Augustine. There are all these little mentions and anecdotes. They would have had access to libraries that didn't survive the Dark Ages, so that's valuable.
So these other sources are super helpful, right? They fill in some gaps, give us different perspectives, and help us get a more complete picture of Socrates.
Exactly, like adding details to a mosaic, building up a richer image.
Okay, so what we're going to do in this deep dive is like carefully peel back those layers. We want to uncover Socrates' core beliefs, particularly about how to live a virtuous life, a life that's truly fulfilling.
Right.
And we're especially interested in his emphasis on self-examination and justice.
Yeah, those are key themes.
Which, you know, totally aligns with what you guys, our amazing listeners, are all about. You're here for knowledge, for those mind-blowing aha moments. So let's jump in and get to know this fascinating, complex dude.
Sounds good. Let's start by painting a picture of Socrates the man. You know, he was a proud Athenian, spent his whole life there, only leaving for military service.
Yeah.
And he could be pretty critical of Athenian society, but deep down, he believed it was the best city-state around.
Interesting.
Now, physically, Socrates was, well, he was pretty unique looking. Our source doesn't sugarcoat it. A broad, upturned nose, prominent eyes that kind of stared, thick lips, and a tendency to be bow-legged.
Oh, wow.
He even walked with this kind of sideways gait. Later on, he developed a bit of a paunch. But, you know, despite all that, he was a constant presence on the streets of Athens, easy to spot, and for many, he was a figure of fun.
Oh, really?
Yeah, people would make fun of him, sometimes even bump into him on purpose.
That's kind of mean.
It is. And when asked why he didn't get upset about this treatment, he had these classic responses, like, if a donkey kicks you, do you take it to court? Or, if someone slaps my face, they don't harm me, only themselves.
That's a great point.
And Alcibiades, the Athenian general and politician who knew him well, he was just amazed by Socrates' imperturbability. Even during that tough retreat from Delium, Socrates stayed calm, like he had this inner peace radiating from him.
So it's like this contrast, right? This like kind of unusual appearance and then this deep inner serenity. He just didn't let anything ruffle his feathers.
Yeah.
Our source even mentions that if he ever got angry, he wouldn't raise his voice like most people, and said he'd lower it and speak very quietly.
Interesting. A quiet anger.
Yeah.
He seems to have been a genuinely good-natured person, reminded the author of Lord Holland, who always seemed to be like walking around with good news. And apparently the people who truly knew Socrates found him pretty impossible to dislike. Some even fell in love with him, figuratively speaking, of course.
Figuratively, yeah. Well, maybe with one exception.
Oh, right.
His wife, Xanthippe. Or, maybe wives, plural.
Yeah, there's some debate about whether he was married twice.
Right. The sources are a little murky on that.
But what we do know for sure is that at the time of his death, he had Xanthippe and 3 young sons. And Xanthippe, well, she has this reputation, right? Kind of a shrew, made his life miserable.
Yeah, that's the story you usually hear.
But the interesting thing is, Socrates himself had a different take on their relationship.
Really?
When people asked him why he chose to marry her, someone, maybe not so easygoing, he'd say something like, well, when it comes to horse training, owners often prefer a spirited animal, one that's a bit more challenging. And when asked if he could live happily with her, he'd reply, yes, and if I can manage her, it proves I could live happily with anyone.
Okay.
He even joked about her temper. There's this famous story about her pouring, dirty water on him from a window after an argument.
Big way.
Yeah, and he just calmly remarked, as always, the thunder is followed by rain.
So he just kind of rolled with it. It seems like he was actually quite content with her, like maybe even enjoyed the challenge.
Perhaps.
Okay, so let's get into Socrates' core beliefs, starting with his ideas about education. What did he think about, learning and knowledge?
Well, Socrates believed that true wisdom starts with recognizing just how much you don't know.
That's kind of humbling.
Right, it is. And this is connected to that famous story about the Oracle of Delphi. The oracle declared that no one was wiser than Socrates. At first he was confused, he didn't think of himself as wise at all.
Makes sense.
But eventually he came to understand it this way. His wisdom lay in the fact that he was aware of his own ignorance, unlike all those folks who were just as ignorant but wouldn't admit it.
Oh, I see. So it's not about knowing all the answers. It's about being aware of what you don't know.
Exactly. And that realization, it really drove him to keep questioning, to keep digging deeper into things.
Okay, so that brings us to his famous method of questioning, right?
Right. Often called elenchus or dialectic.
Yeah, the Socratic Method.
Exactly. Basically, it's like a collaborative investigation. Socrates would ask a series of questions, not to just give people the answers, but to guide them, help them see the inconsistencies in their own thinking.
So it's about leading people to their own understanding.
Yeah, drawing it out of them. He compared himself to a midwife.
Yeah.
Not delivering the baby himself, but helping others give birth to the truths that were already inside them.
Interesting analogy.
And a big part of his method was this thing called Socratic irony. Basically saying something but meaning the opposite.
Playing with words a bit.
Exactly. It was a subtle tool, you know. And our source points out that the fact that irony was used so often in 5th century Athens, well, it shows that society was pretty intellectually sophisticated. But, as our source also notes, irony could be tricky. Not everyone understood it. And sometimes it just led to confusion or even resentment.
Oh, yeah, I could see that. But even with the irony, the goal of Socrates' questioning was always to get people to think for themselves, to examine their own beliefs.
Right. And he captured that beautifully in his famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living."
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
It's powerful, right?
Yeah.
For Socrates, it wasn't just a philosophical idea. It was the key to living a meaningful life.
Okay, so now let's move on to justice.
Yeah.
How did Socrates view justice, and how did that differ from, the common understanding at the time?
So for Socrates, acting justly was the most important thing, above everything else, even his own life.
Wow.
He said, and I quote, "If a man is worth anything, he would give no weight whatsoever to any other consideration, even life itself, rather than act unjustly."
That's a powerful statement.
It is, and it was a pretty radical idea back then. The common Greek view of justice was more about doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies.
Okay, so, tit for tat.
Yeah, exactly. But Socrates flipped that on its head. He believed in doing good even to those who had wronged you, with the goal of turning enemies into friends.
That's interesting. Our source actually compares this to Christ's teaching of turn the other cheek.
Yeah, it's a similar idea.
It's like, don't stoop to their level, rise above it.
Exactly. Socrates was a moral absolutist.
Okay, so what does that mean?
It means he believed that you should never intentionally do wrong, never retaliate with wrong for wrong, never return evil for evil.
Never.
Never. In Plato's dialogue, Crito, Socrates lays out several principles based on this. Essentially, he argues that to commit an injustice, even in response to another injustice, damages your own soul.
Oh, I see.
He knew that these beliefs would be controversial, that people who held them would often clash with those who didn't.
And we see this play out in his own life,
Yeah.
right? Like after the naval battle of Arginusae.
Right. There was this committee formed to try a bunch of generals all at once.
Uh-huh.
And Socrates, he was the only one on the committee who saw that this was illegal.
And he stood up against it, even though it could have meant getting in trouble himself.
Exactly. He refused to participate in something he saw as a perversion of justice, even when facing a really angry public.
That's really courageous.
It is. Okay, so now let's shift gears a bit and talk about Socrates' views on pleasure, virtue, and the soul.
Okay.
He believed that controlling your desires, especially bodily desires, was really important for developing your soul and pursuing virtue.
So like keeping your physical urges in check so you can focus on what really matters.
Exactly. He saw those physical urges as distractions from the real goal, achieving inner excellence.
Got it.
And his understanding of the soul was pretty interesting. Unlike Plato, who had a much more complex view, Socrates saw the soul as a single, unified entity, and he believed it was potentially immortal.
Our source actually points out that this simpler view of the soul is closer to how we understand the term today.
It is, and it really influenced Christian thought later on. For Socrates, cultivating the soul through virtue was the path to living a truly good life.
Okay, now let's address a couple of more sensitive topics. Socrates' views on homosexual love and slavery.
All right.
So, romantic relationships between men were pretty common in ancient Athens. But despite this, our source says there's no evidence that Socrates himself engaged in homosexual acts. He seemed to appreciate male beauty in a more intellectual and visual way.
Right.
Now, when it comes to slavery, which was, a huge part of Athenian society, our source points out a really significant silence in Socrates' philosophy.
Oh, yeah.
Even with his strong emphasis on justice, he never explicitly condemned slavery.
That's a tough one to reconcile with his other beliefs.
It is. It's possible that he questioned it privately, but there's nothing concrete to suggest he did. Our source even wonders if maybe if he did raise those questions in his conversations, it could have added to the resentment and suspicion against him, leading to his trial.
It's possible.
Right. So speaking of his trial, what can you tell us about that? Why was Socrates put on trial and what was the outcome?
Well, our source suggests that a big part of it was guilt by association. Socrates had been close with Critias and Alcibiades, both of whom were pretty controversial figures associated with tyranny and impiety. And even though Socrates wasn't involved in any of their actions, that connection probably hurt him.
Right, especially because Athens was still recovering from the rule of the 30 tyrants.
Exactly. The political climate was tense, people were suspicious.
So when Socrates was given the chance to suggest an alternative punishment to the death penalty, he did something really unexpected.
He proposed that he should be rewarded for his service to Athens, maybe with free meals in the Prytaneum, an honor usually given to Olympic victors and major benefactors.
Really?
Yeah. And unfortunately, it backfired. The jury saw it as arrogant, disrespectful. It probably sealed his fate.
Oh, wow.
The vote against him swung even harder, and he was condemned to death.
But even facing death, Socrates stayed incredibly calm and composed.
He did. He believed in upholding the law, even when he felt it was unjustly applied to him. And he refused to escape, sticking to his principle that doing something wrong never justifies another wrong.
That takes a lot of strength.
His final days in prison were pretty remarkable. Our source says that's when his intellectual activity really peaked. Like being physically confined somehow freed his mind. He had these deep discussions with his friends about the soul and death.
He approached death with a peaceful acceptance. He saw it as either a long, dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where he could talk with other great minds.
Oh, no fear of death.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He believed that a true philosopher shouldn't fear death.
And in his final moments, He remained dignified and composed.
Even the jailer who had to give him the hemlock was moved by Socrates.
Wow.
He described him as the noblest, gentlest, and bravest man he'd ever met.
It's a powerful image.
It is. So if you're enjoying this deep dive into Socrates and his ideas, and you like this kind of exploration of philosophy, you might also enjoy Mindful Moments. It's an AI audiobook analysis channel on YouTube that explores similar themes of wisdom and understanding.
It's a great suggestion for our listeners.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, let's go over the key takeaways from Socrates' life and philosophy.
Okay.
First, he stressed self-examination. It's the foundation of true wisdom. Second, he was absolutely committed to virtue and justice,
Above everything else.
even when facing death. And third, he accepted his fate based on his moral principles. He wouldn't compromise what he believed in.
Powerful stuff.
And maybe the biggest lesson here is that real fulfillment doesn't come from chasing external rewards, but from developing your inner self, that integrity, that commitment to what's right.
It's a lesson that still resonates today.
All right, here's a final thought for you to ponder.
Yeah.
In a world that's still struggling with injustice, with all these temptations for instant gratification, what can we learn from Socrates' unwavering commitment to his principles, even when facing death?
That's a question worth thinking about.
And now for our call to action. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please subscribe to the show for more explorations of profound ideas.
Yes, subscribe.
Share this episode with your friends, family, anyone who you think might find it interesting. And if you want to really dig into Socrates, check out Socrates, A Man for Our Times. We've got a link in the show notes.
Great book.
And most importantly, always think critically about the information you come across. That's what Socrates would have wanted. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.